October 1941. After months of brutal fighting, Army Group Center stood before what it believed was the final door to victory. Hitler ordered Operation Typhoon, the decisive blow that would capture Moscow, end Soviet resistance, and finish the war before winter arrived. German soldiers, exhausted but confident, prepared for the last great push. Their generals assured them that the Soviet Union was collapsing, that victory was weeks away. Propaganda posters in Berlin already hinted at a triumphant march through Red Square. At first, the German advance moved like a storm. Panzer spearheads pierced Soviet lines with mechanical precision, encircling entire armies at Vyazma and Bryansk. Thousands of Soviet soldiers fell into captivity. Thousands more died under relentless airstrikes. High command in Berlin celebrated. The Red Colossus seemed to be breaking, but beneath this momentum lay a hidden danger. The Germans were overextended. Their supply lines stretched across hundreds of kilometers of ruins, and roads dissolving into mud rains began to fall, turning the ground into the infamous Rasputitsa, a sucking swamp that swallowed trucks and horses alike. While the Germans pushed forward, the Soviets dug in trench lines deepened, factories shifted to round-the-clock production, and civilians prepared for the worst. Moscow became not just a city, but a fortress. Operation Typhoon had begun. But the storm ahead would not be the one Hitler expected. By mid-October, the weather turned against the invaders. What had been firm dirt roads in summer became endless rivers of mud. Panzer divisions that once surged forward at lightning speed now crawled at a walking pace. Trucks bogged down to their axles. Supply convoys stalled. Horses collapsed from exhaustion. The Wehrmacht had never imagined the sheer brutality of the Russian mud soldiers marched knee-deep in sludge, carrying ammunition by hand. Artillery pieces required dozens of men to push them through terrain that seemed alive, pulling everything downward. Fuel shortages grew catastrophic, and food arrived days late, if at all. Meanwhile, the Soviets used the mud to reorganize. Reinforcements from Siberia, Kazakhstan, and the Far East traveled by rail toward Moscow. The Stavka began planning countermeasures, gathering reserves that had been hidden from German intelligence. The German high command ignored warning signs. Hitler demanded speed. But speed was impossible. Blitzkrieg had stopped dead in its tracks. The battlefield was no longer shaped by strategy, but by nature itself. Operation Typhoon was bleeding momentum, one muddy kilometer at a time. Despite the mud, the Germans achieved staggering encirclements at Vyazma and Bryansk. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers were trapped in vast pockets, surrounded by armor and bombed relentlessly from above. German officers sent triumphal messages to Berlin. The road to Moscow is open. But the truth was far more complicated. Inside the encirclements, Soviet troops fought like cornered wolves. Entire regiments broke out at night, slipping through gaps between exhausted German units. The NKVD organized resistance cells to disrupt German logistics, and while tens of thousands were captured, many escaped to join newly forming defensive lines closer to Moscow. These delays were fatal for the Wehrmacht. Every hour spent crushing pockets was an hour closer to winter, and an hour the Soviets used to fortify the capital. German soldiers, confident from earlier victories, now felt the first sting of doubt. Moscow still seemed close, but not close enough. In Berlin, Hitler celebrated prematurely. On the front lines, officers saw the truth. Operation Typhoon was losing time, and time would become the deadliest enemy of all. As German forces inched closer, Moscow transformed into a fortress, unlike anything seen in modern war. Over 200,000 civilians, women, students, even the elderly, dug anti-tank trenches around the city. Thousands of barricades rose across boulevards. Government archives were evacuated east. Factories switched to tank and ammunition production overnight. Stalin refused to leave. "I will stay in Moscow," he declared. His presence sent a clear message to the world. Moscow would fight, not flee. On November 7th, the famous Revolution Day parade took place right on Red Square, even as German artillery could be heard in the distance. Soldiers marched past the Kremlin and then directly to the front lines. The world watched in astonishment. Moscow did not panic. It prepared. The contrast with the German forces could not have been sharper. The Wehrmacht struggled with frostbite, broken machinery, and faltering morale. Soviet defenders grew more determined with every passing day. Operation Typhoon began as a march toward an easy victory. Instead, it awakened a city ready to fight for its life. Late November brought temperatures plunging lower than the Germans had experienced in a century. Engines froze solid. Machine gun bolts cracked. Oil turned to jelly. Thousands of soldiers suffered frostbite. Some lost fingers, others entire limbs. The Wehrmacht, dressed in thin autumn uniforms, was being destroyed without a single Soviet bullet. Meanwhile, the Red Army was preparing something the Germans never expected: a counterattack. Fresh Siberian divisions, trained in Arctic warfare, began arriving near Moscow. They wore fur-lined uniforms, carried reliable rifles that functioned in freezing temperatures, and moved across snow with ease. Soviet commanders, recognizing the enemy's exhaustion, positioned these troops in key sectors. Then, the blizzard came. Visibility dropped to 0 meters. German positions disappeared under mountains of snow. Communications collapsed. For the first time since the war began, the Germans understood they were no longer in control. Blitzkrieg was dead. Operation Typhoon was dying. And winter, Russia's oldest ally, had arrived to claim its price. As the cold tightened its grip, the German supply system, already stretched to breaking, began to collapse completely. Trucks that had traveled thousands of kilometers from Poland and East Prussia now sat frozen in long, motionless columns. Horses, the backbone of German logistics, died by the tens of thousands, collapsing in the snow with their ribs showing soldiers cut open the frozen carcasses just to extract the body heat. Ammunition arrived days too late. Food arrived half-rotten. Fuel shortages became catastrophic. Tanks intended for breakthrough operations were cannibalized for parts just to keep a few panzers alive. Entire artillery batteries were abandoned because the guns could no longer be moved. German officers had no illusions. They were no longer conducting an offensive. They were struggling to survive. Meanwhile, Soviet supply lines improved. Trains arrived from the Urals with winter coats, weapons, and fresh divisions. For the first time since June, the Red Army had more strength than its opponent. Operation Typhoon wasn't just slowing, it was bleeding out. The land outside Moscow transformed into an alien world of ice and death. Snowdrifts swallowed trenches, rifles froze unless kept inside clothing. Soldiers lit fires inside holes dug beneath tanks just to stay alive, a practice that killed many when fuel fumes ignited. German units reported temperatures as low as -40 degrees Celsius. Frostbite became a greater enemy than the Red Army. Men awoke with their boots frozen to the ground. Others found their fingers blackened, unable to pull triggers. Machine guns shattered when fired. Radios died. Fuel tanks cracked. The Soviets suffered their own horrors, frozen wounds, starvation, and sleepless nights. But they were prepared. They had winter boots, padded jackets, and camouflage. They had fought in these temperatures before. The Germans had not. The battlefield became a graveyard of metal and men. The blitzkrieg had transformed into a slow, suffocating nightmare. By late November, German troops managed to reach the towns of Klin, Istra, and even Khimki, just 20 kilometers from the Kremlin. Through field binoculars, some German soldiers claimed they could see the distant glow of Moscow, but they would get no closer. Every attempt to push forward was met with fierce Soviet resistance. Fresh divisions blocked every forest path and frozen road. Soviet artillery hammered the advancing Germans, while snipers in white camouflage stalked them from rooftops and tree lines. Hitler demanded that Moscow be taken at any cost. But the cost was too high. German officers pleaded for permission to pull back to more defensible positions. Hitler refused. Instead, he ordered more frontal assaults. One way, weaker than the last, the Wehrmacht had reached its limit. The last breath of Operation Typhoon was fading. Inside Moscow, Stalin faced his own crisis. Advisors urged him to evacuate to Kuibyshev, arguing that if he were killed, the Soviet Union might collapse, but Stalin stayed. He appeared in public, walked the streets, visited factories, spoke on the radio. His presence transformed the city's morale. Factories produced weapons 24 hours a day. Civilians volunteered for defense units. Trenches extended for hundreds of kilometers. Anti-tank obstacles cut across major boulevards. Even as bombs fell, the city beat like a single heart, unwavering, defiant, alive. Stalin knew that if Moscow fell, the Soviet Union might die with it, so he gambled everything on one plan: hold until winter, then counterattack. The fate of the war hung on those weeks. With Japan refusing to attack the Soviet Far East, Stalin unleashed his greatest hidden reserve, the Siberian divisions. Hardened by sub-zero winters, trained in harsh wilderness, equipped with the best winter gear in the Red Army, they were unlike any troops the Germans had faced. They arrived around Moscow like a tide of ghosts: white snowsuits, skis, sleds, silent discipline. Their first attacks shattered German expectations. Siberian units moved with fluid precision, cutting through German lines in forests and frozen fields. Their marksmanship was legendary, their endurance unmatched. For the German soldiers, many already frostbitten and starving, the appearance of these elite troops was a nightmare. They had come to conquer a collapsing enemy. Instead, they found an army growing stronger by the hour. Operation Typhoon had no answer for Siberia. On December 5, 1941, the Red Army unleashed its long-awaited counterattack. Thousands of artillery batteries fired in unison, creating a rolling thunder that shook the frozen ground. Infantry surged forward under cover of snowstorms. T-34 tanks, better suited for winter terrain, maneuvered where German panzers could not. The German front buckled instantly. Entire regiments collapsed from shock and exhaustion. Others fled without orders, abandoning equipment along the way. Officers described scenes of chaos, retreats turning into panicked runs, wounded men freezing to death on the roadside, supply wagons stuck in ice. The Soviets advanced, slowly but relentlessly. For the first time in the war, the Wehrmacht experienced defeat not as a maneuver, but as a reality. Operation Typhoon had failed. As Soviet pressure intensified, German commanders begged Hitler for the freedom to withdraw to shorter, safer lines. Hitler refused. His orders were absolute. Stand fast, no retreat. Hold every meter. These orders turned defensive operations into slaughter. Soldiers froze in positions that could not be supplied. Reinforcements never arrived. Entire battalions died where they stood. When retreat finally became unavoidable, it was chaotic, rushed, and deadly. The roads filled with broken machines and frozen corpses. The Wehrmacht was not withdrawing, it was disintegrating. Operation Typhoon had transformed into a disaster. Throughout December and January, Soviet forces pushed the Germans westward. Towns captured during the offensive were liberated one by one. The front line, once just outside Moscow, moved back by more than 150 kilometers. For the Germans, each step backward was agony. For the Soviets, each step forward was redemption. Yet the counter-offensive strained the Red Army as well. Logistics faltered. Lack of fuel and ammunition slowed progress. Many Soviet divisions were exhausted from months of constant fighting. The winter punished both sides, but only one was retreating. The German dream of capturing Moscow was buried in the snow. By February 1942, the failed offensive was undeniable. The German army had lost more than 500,000 men to combat, frostbite, and disease. Thousands of vehicles were abandoned. The Wehrmacht, once feared across Europe, now limped through frozen forests in torn uniforms and worn-out boots. German morale was shattered. Officers wrote in their diaries, "We underestimated everything. The winter is stronger than any army. Russia is not Europe." Hitler blamed the generals. The generals blamed Hitler. But history knew the truth. Operation Typhoon was doomed from the start. Operation Typhoon ended not with a dramatic defeat, but with a slow, suffocating collapse. The Wehrmacht failed to capture Moscow. The myth of German invincibility was shattered. The Soviet Union had survived its darkest hour. For the first time, the world believed Hitler could be stopped. The Red Army, stabilized and reborn, would go on to achieve victories at Stalingrad, Kursk, and beyond. Operation Typhoon became the first great turning point, the moment when the unstoppable German war machine met a force stronger than itself: winter endurance, the will of a nation refusing to die. From the ruins of Typhoon rose the counter-offensive that would ultimately reach Berlin.